Welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every case challenges your intellect, every clue sharpens your instincts, and every mystery pulls you deeper into the unknown. Grab a seat, stay sharp, and let's unravel the truth together. Sherlock Holmes and the Man Who Died Twice. Chapter 1. The Man Who Returned from the Dead. It was a night of ceaseless rain, the kind that blurred the gaslight's glow and left London shrouded in restless gloom. The steady patter against the windows of 221B Baker Street served as a rhythmic counterpoint to the crackling fire in the hearth. I had settled into my chair, pen in hand, recording Holmes's latest triumph, some small matter of stolen documents that hardly seemed worth his talents. Holmes, reclining upon the settee, exhaled a thin wisp of smoke, his sharp gaze lost in the ceiling's intricate shadows. He had been unusually quiet that evening, his violin untouched, his restless energy subdued. It was a rare lull, the kind that never lasted long. And then, a frantic knock. 3 sharp raps, urgent, desperate. Holmes's gaze flicked toward the door in an instant. I rose to answer, but he lifted a hand, stopping me. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "Whoever stands beyond that door is trembling." I hesitated. The knock came again, more insistent. With a glance at Holmes, I turned the knob. The door swung open to reveal a man, soaked to the bone, his face pale as the dead, his breath ragged with exertion. His eyes darted wildly about the room before settling on Holmes, his lips parting as if to speak. But no words came. Holmes leaned forward, his expression sharpening. "Well," he said, "it seems the night has brought us an impossible tale." The man stumbled inside, his wet boots leaving a dark trail upon the wooden floor. I guided him to a chair near the fire, where he sat heavily, his hands trembling, his breath unsteady. Holmes, never one for unnecessary pleasantries, studied him intently. "Your name?" "Edward," the man gasped. "Edward Langford." I started at the name. "Langford? Any relation to Albert Langford?" The man turned to me, his eyes hollow. "Albert was my brother." Holmes exhaled softly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Was?" Edward nodded, his throat convulsing as if he could barely force the words out. He died 2 days ago. We buried him at Highgate Cemetery. I watched as they lowered his coffin into the ground. He broke off, shaking his head violently. Holmes observed him with razor-sharp interest. "Yet," Edward's voice trembled as he continued, "tonight I saw him, walking through the streets of London." A silence followed, thick and suffocating. The fire crackled, the wind howled against the window panes, and the shadows stretched across the room like silent witnesses to his claim. I exchanged a glance with Holmes, expecting him to dismiss the absurdity. But his expression remained unreadable, his gaze locked upon Edward as though he were a specimen under a microscope. "You are certain it was your brother?" Holmes asked at last. Edward's hands clenched into fists. "I swear it. He was wearing the suit we buried him in, and his face. It was Albert's face." Holmes tapped a single finger against the armrest of his chair, his mind already at work. "Fascinating," he murmured. I cleared my throat, attempting to dispel the uneasy weight settling in my chest. "Holmes, I was at Albert Langford's funeral." Both men turned to me. I nodded firmly. I was acquainted with the Langford family, distantly, through a mutual friend. When I heard of Albert's passing, I attended the burial out of respect. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "And?" I hesitated, recalling the bleak afternoon, the damp earth, the solemn procession. I saw the body before it was interred. It was most certainly Albert Langford. He had been ill for some time. His passing was expected. Edward's voice wavered. "Then, how do you explain what I saw?" I turned to Holmes, expecting some dismissive remark about the tricks of the mind or the effects of grief upon perception. But his expression was sharp, calculating. "There are only 2 possibilities," he said coolly. "Either you were mistaken, Watson, or something is very, very wrong." A chill ran down my spine. Holmes rose abruptly, retrieving his coat. "We must go to Highgate Cemetery," he said. "Immediately." The journey through London's fog-cloaked streets was made in near silence, save for the rhythmic clatter of hooves upon cobblestone. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and as we approached Highgate Cemetery, the great iron gates loomed before us like the gaping maw of some ancient beast. Edward hesitated at the entrance, his face drawn. Holmes, however, strode forward with brisk efficiency. "Watson, your revolver," he said. I blinked. "You expect trouble?" Holmes merely extended his hand. I sighed and handed him the firearm, which he tucked into his coat. The cemetery was eerily still, save for the whispering wind through the trees. We navigated the winding path until we reached Albert Langford's grave. Holmes halted. "Here," he murmured. Edward let out a strangled gasp. The grave had been disturbed. The soil, once neatly packed, was uneven, as if something had clawed its way out. I took an involuntary step back, my breath catching. "Good God!" Holmes knelt, running his fingers over the damp earth. He then reached into his pocket, retrieving a small lantern, and held it low to the ground. A trail of footprints led away from the grave, not toward it, away. Edward swayed on his feet. "You see?" he whispered. "You see?" He walked away. Holmes's expression remained unreadable. Slowly, he rose. "We are no longer investigating a simple case of mistaken identity," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "No," I murmured. "We are not." The carriage rattled through the silent streets, the thick London fog swallowing the gaslights and turning them into ghostly orbs in the darkness. Edward Langford sat hunched beside me, his hands wringing together as though trying to keep his nerves from unravelling. Across from us, Holmes sat motionless, his sharp gaze fixed upon the window, though I knew his mind was far from the rain-slicked glass. "We should prepare ourselves for the mundane, Watson," he murmured at last. "The dead do not rise, no matter how convincing an apparition may appear." Edward's head snapped up, his voice hoarse. "But I saw him, Mr. Holmes, I swear it. My own brother, walking as if death had never taken him." Holmes regarded him for a long moment, then simply said, "We shall see." As we neared Highgate Cemetery, the trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The heavy iron gates stood ajar, and beyond them the headstones stretched into the darkness like the bones of a forgotten city. The moment we stepped beyond the threshold, a hush fell over the air. Thick, oppressive, unnatural. The world seemed to hold its breath. Holmes glanced at me. "Your revolver, Watson." I handed it over without hesitation. Something was very wrong here. Without another word, Holmes pressed forward, leading us into the graveyard's yawning abyss. We moved in silence, our footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The gravestones passed like solemn sentinels, each bearing the weight of the dead beneath them. Edward trembled violently. "It's just ahead," he whispered. Holmes halted abruptly. I followed his gaze and felt my breath catch in my throat. Albert Langford's grave had been disturbed. The neat mound of earth that had once covered the coffin was now a ruin of churned soil. The headstone stood at a precarious angle, as if something had pushed against it from below. Edward let out a choked noise and stumbled forward, dropping to his knees beside the grave. "No," he gasped. "No, no, no." Holmes knelt, running a gloved hand through the damp earth. "This was no simple grave robbery," he muttered. "The soil has been forced outward, as if something inside was pushing its way free." A cold prickle traced its way down my spine. "Holmes, are you suggesting—" He held up a hand. "No conclusions yet, Watson. Only observations." Then, with a grim expression, he reached into his coat and withdrew his lantern. "Let us see what other secrets the dead have left behind." Holmes swung the lantern low, its flickering glow illuminating the ground. And then we saw them. Footprints. They trailed away from the grave, pressed deep into the mud, leading toward the mist-drenched path beyond. I took a sharp breath. Holmes? I see it, Watson, he said quietly. But the horror lay not in their presence, but in their impossibility. There were no footprints leading toward the grave, only away. Holmes's fingers tightened around the lantern handle. Fascinating, he murmured, almost to himself. Edward staggered backward. Do you believe me now? He demanded, his voice raw with fear. Albert is alive. He climbed out of his own grave. Holmes did not answer at first. Instead, he straightened, adjusting his coat, his mind already leaping ahead. This is no resurrection, he said at last, but a deception, a careful, deliberate deception. Holmes bent down, scrutinizing the footprints as if they were a cipher only he could decipher. A man, recently buried, does not walk away from his own grave unaided, he said. Which means, I swallowed, which means someone wanted us to believe he did. Holmes nodded. Precisely. Edward let out a broken laugh, his hands gripping his hair. But how? I saw him. With my own eyes. I saw Albert walking. Perhaps, Holmes murmured. Or perhaps you saw what someone wished you to see. I exhaled slowly, watching as Holmes followed the footprints with his eyes, calculating. Then what are we looking for? Holmes turned to me, the ghost of a smile curling at his lips. The one thing that cannot lie, Watson, he said softly. The truth. Then, with a final glance at the disturbed grave, he strode forward, following the trail into the darkness. Chapter 2. A corpse returns to haunt London. The morning was damp, the mist reluctant to lift from the streets as we arrived at Harrington and Sons, undertakers, a solemn establishment that had tended to London's dead for nearly a century. The air inside was thick with the scent of polished wood and candle wax, the silence so profound it seemed disrespectful to break it. A thin, balding man in a dark frock coat emerged from the shadows of his workshop, his fingers still dusted with embalming powder. Mr. Harrington, Holmes greeted him. We come regarding the late Albert Langford. The undertaker's brow furrowed. A tragic case, sir, laid to rest just days ago. Holmes's sharp gaze pinned him in place. And yet his grave was found disturbed last night. The man paled. His fingers twitched. Disturbed? Yes, I interjected. And more curiously still, his brother swears he saw Albert walking the streets of London. For a moment, Harrington was silent. Then, with a slow, measured movement, he reached into a cabinet, withdrew a ledger, and opened it to a carefully inscribed entry. Albert Langford was embalmed and interred properly, he said. There is no mistake. Holmes tapped a finger against the page. No mistake indeed. Which means that if Albert Langford is walking the streets of London, someone else is in his grave. The Black Swan Inn was a dimly lit establishment on the east side of London, a haunt of dockworkers, gamblers, and those who preferred their business to remain in the shadows. The scent of ale and damp wood filled the air as we stepped inside. The barmaid, a sharp-eyed woman with auburn hair and a keen sense of curiosity, set down a tankard and regarded us warily. You're the detective, aren't you? She said, glancing at Holmes. I read about you in the papers. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Then you know I do not come without reason. She wiped her hands on her apron. And I reckon I know what it's about. You want to know if I saw Albert Langford? Edward Langford, who had accompanied us, sucked in a sharp breath. You did see him? I asked. She nodded. 2 nights ago. Came in here clear as day, ordered a brandy, paid in coin, and left. I frowned. You're certain? Course I'm certain. He even joked with me. Said, it's good to have a drink after so long in the cold. Edward made a strangled noise in the back of his throat. Holmes, however, remained still, his expression unreadable. And yet, Albert Langford was buried beneath 6 feet of earth when you claim to have seen him. The barmaid's eyes darkened. Then, sir, you should ask yourself this. Who was it that I served that night? As we stepped back onto the fog-laden streets, Edward Langford was muttering to himself, his face ashen. It was him. I know it was him, he insisted. First I saw him, then she saw him. It cannot be a coincidence. Holmes turned to him with the air of a man dissecting a puzzle. I advise you to consider the alternative, Mr. Langford, that what you saw was not your brother, but an illusion crafted to deceive you. Edward's head snapped up. An illusion? Indeed. Holmes pressed his gloved fingers together. A clever trick designed to unsettle, to confuse, to mislead. And if I may be so bold, he eyed Edward keenly. It has been exceedingly effective. Edward bristled. You think me mad? Holmes sighed. I think you are in the throes of grief, Mr. Langford, and grief makes men vulnerable to suggestion. I could no longer remain silent. But Holmes, we now have two witnesses, Edward and the barmaid. Surely that must count for something. It does, Holmes conceded. It tells me that this deception is not random, it is calculated. He fell into step beside me, his voice low and deliberate. Consider, Watson. Albert Langford is dead. His body was embalmed, and yet his image is seen moving about London. I shuddered at the thought. Then what are you suggesting? Holmes's gaze gleamed in the dim light. I suggest, my dear Watson, that somewhere within this city there is a man who bears the face of Albert Langford, but is not Albert Langford at all. The Langford estate was a grand, sorrowful place, its once proud facade now dulled by mourning. We were shown to the drawing room, where Eleanor Langford received us in her widow's black, her face pale and composed. I have nothing more to say, she said flatly. My husband is gone. I have made my peace. Holmes studied her. I fear your peace may be premature, Mrs. Langford. Her fingers twitched. I don't know what you mean. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a single folded letter. Then perhaps you can explain this. She stiffened. Where did you get that? Your maid was kind enough to provide it, Holmes said, along with several others, letters written in your late husband's own hand, and postmarked after his death. Edward gasped. Albert wrote to you. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. They began arriving 2 nights ago, she admitted. I thought it a cruel joke, a mistake, but then I read them. She reached into a drawer and retrieved another letter, trembling as she handed it to Holmes. He unfolded the parchment and read aloud. My dearest Eleanor, I have little time. They have made a mistake. I am not dead. Come to me, and I will prove it. The silence in the room was deafening. Holmes folded the letter, slipping it into his pocket. You should have come to me at once. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. Tell me, Mr. Holmes, is my husband dead or not? Holmes held her gaze. Then, with unsettling certainty, he answered, Your husband is dead, Mrs. Langford. But that does not mean he has stopped writing. The fog was thick as we made our way to the Thames embankment, where the murky water lapped against the stone walls. The streets were near deserted save for the occasional flicker of a distant lantern or the shuffling footsteps of some lone wanderer. Holmes had received word from an informant, a dock worker who claimed to have seen Albert Langford, or rather, someone wearing his face. The man in question, a burly figure with salt-stiffened clothes, gestured toward the riverbank. Saw him plain as day, I did. Stood right there under the gaslight. Gave me a look, then turned and walked off toward that alley. Edward Langford's breath hitched. Did you speak to him? The dock worker shook his head. I was too stunned. Looked like he recognized me, though. But when I went after him... He hesitated, glancing toward Holmes. Well, sir, he was just... gone. Holmes strode toward the alley entrance, his gaze sweeping the damp cobblestones. Suddenly, he knelt. A hat lay discarded near a pile of broken crates. Lifting it, He examined the label stitched inside. "Watson," he said, his voice curiously low, "would you care to read this name aloud?" I stepped closer and squinted in the dim light. The letters, though slightly faded, were unmistakable. Albert Langford. Edward recoiled. "No, no, this cannot be." Holmes turned the hat in his fingers. "Oh, it most certainly can, Mr. Langford. The real question is, why did he leave it behind?" The next morning, we arrived at Dr. Alistair Finch's practice, a modest yet respectable establishment tucked away near Cavendish Square. The man had been Albert Langford's physician, and the one who had officially pronounced him dead. Dr. Finch was a wiry figure, his thinning hair combed meticulously to one side. He greeted us with a forced smile, but as soon as Holmes introduced our purpose, the colour drained from his face. You wish to discuss Albert Langford?" His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his coat. I have already given my statement to the authorities." Holmes studied him like a specimen beneath a lens. "And yet, Doctor, your hesitation suggests you recall something more." Dr. Finch swallowed hard. I examined him myself. He had no pulse, no breath. His body was cold. I tell you, he was dead." "Of that I have no doubt," Holmes said smoothly. "Yet it is most curious, is it not, that he has since been observed wandering the streets of London?" Dr. Finch's lips parted, then closed again. He was sweating now, despite the cool air. Holmes took a step closer. "Tell me, Doctor, is it possible that a man could feign death so convincingly that even you would not detect it?" Dr. Finch's hands twitched. That is absurd." Holmes's gaze darkened. "Is it?" For a long moment, the only sound was the distant ticking of a clock. Then, with a sudden, ragged exhale, Dr. Finch muttered, almost too low to hear, "I should never have agreed to it." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Ah, now we are getting somewhere." That night, as we sat in the dim glow of 221B Baker Street, Holmes seemed unusually restless. He tapped his fingers against the armrest of his chair, his mind working in that silent, methodical way of his. "You have an idea, Holmes?" I inquired at last. "Several," he murmured, "and none of them are particularly comforting." Before I could press further, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a small envelope. "This just arrived for you, Mr. Holmes." "No messenger, just left at the door." Holmes took it with a nod, turned it over, and froze. His grip tightened slightly. I leaned forward. "What is it?" Instead of answering, he passed me the envelope. The handwriting on the front was elegant, precise. The name inscribed upon it sent a cold shudder through me. Sherlock Holmes. But it was the signature at the bottom that truly made my blood run cold. Albert Langford. I looked up at Holmes, but he had already opened the letter, his eyes scanning the contents. Then, in a low voice, he read, "Mr. Holmes, I must speak with you. I have little time. Meet me at the old pier at midnight. You alone. Tell no one. I will explain everything." Edward let out an audible gasp. It cannot be." I turned to Holmes. "Surely this is a trick." Holmes set the letter aside and rose, retrieving his coat with a quiet efficiency. "A trick? Perhaps." He adjusted his cuffs. "But one does not ignore a letter from the dead, Watson." I stood abruptly. "You cannot seriously mean to go." He glanced at me with that familiar, unreadable expression. "On the contrary, Watson, there is nowhere I would rather be." Chapter 3. The Second Death. The dockyard was a place of restless shadows, where the fog curled like ghostly fingers over the water's surface. The scent of brine and rotting wood hung thick in the air, and somewhere in the distance, the mournful call of a ship's bell tolled like a funeral dirge. Holmes and I stood beneath the flickering glow of a gas lamp, our collars turned against the damp wind. The letter, still folded in Holmes's pocket, had led us here, to a meeting with a man who should not exist. Edward Langford fidgeted beside me, his breath coming in short, nervous gasps. "It's him," he muttered. "It must be. Albert is alive. He will explain everything." Holmes exhaled slowly, watching the darkened pier. If he comes at all. For several long minutes we waited, the silence stretching, oppressive. Then, a sound. The faint slosh of water, a whisper of movement. Holmes's head snapped toward the river. "There," he murmured. A figure moved through the mist, its steps slow, deliberate, until suddenly it stopped, and then, without a sound, it vanished. Edward staggered forward. "Albert!" Then, a splash. Holmes' voice was sharp. "Watson, look!" I turned just as a body broke the water's surface, its pale hand reaching toward the sky. For a moment, we could only stare. The figure bobbed in the murky water, its limbs slack, its face turned skyward, eyes wide and sightless. Edward made a strangled sound and lurched forward, but Holmes caught him by the arm. "No," he said. "Wait." I fumbled for the nearest mooring rope, but Holmes was already ahead of me, securing a line. With methodical efficiency, he hauled the body toward the pier, the sodden weight dragging against the current. The lantern light fell upon the face. Edward gasped, his knees nearly buckling. God in heaven! It was Albert Langford. Or at least, it should have been. I had seen Albert Langford's body lowered into his grave. Yet here he was, pale as death, his lips tinged with the blue hue of drowning. His clothes clung to his body, slick with river water, and for a single, terrible moment, I thought I saw his chest rise, as if death had not quite claimed him. But no, Albert Langford was dead. Holmes knelt beside him, his expression unreadable. "Twice buried," he murmured, "and yet twice he returns." A shiver ran through me. "Holmes," I whispered, "what are we dealing with?" The body lay before us, silent, unmoving. But there was no mistaking it. This was Albert Langford, and yet, if that were true, who had been buried in his place? Edward Langford fell to his knees beside the corpse, his hands shaking. "I don't understand," he whispered. I saw him die. I saw him buried." Holmes remained unnervingly still. "Did you?" Edward looked up, his eyes wild. "What do you mean?" Holmes's gaze remained locked on the dead man's face. "You saw a body buried, certainly, but are you sure, beyond doubt, that it was Albert Langford?" A flicker of hesitation crossed Edward's face. I... Holmes exhaled softly. "Precisely." I crouched beside him. "But Holmes, that doesn't explain why he is here, why he is dead again." Holmes tilted his head, studying the corpse. "That, Watson, is the question upon which this entire mystery hinges." His fingers ghosted over the body's wrists, his brow furrowing slightly. Then, he reached into his pocket and produced a magnifying glass. He inspected the man's fingertips, then his throat, before leaning back with a curious expression. "Watson," he said, his tone carrying that particular lilt of satisfaction, "there is something very wrong with this body." My skin prickled. "What do you mean?" Holmes lifted his gaze to mine. "Look closely. There are two different stories written upon this man's flesh. One tells of a fresh murder, and the other." He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The other belongs to a corpse that should have never moved again." Holmes produced a small case from his coat and withdrew a delicate instrument, using it to pry open the corpse's lips. He peered inside, his expression darkening. "Curious," he murmured. "What is it?" I asked. Instead of answering, he gestured for my assistance. "Watson, examine the skin of his hands." I did as he asked. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but then I noticed something. Good Lord! The skin beneath the nails was stained faintly with ink. Holmes nodded. "Yes, and there is something else." He gestured toward the throat. At first glance, Albert Langford's cause of death seemed obvious: drowning. His lips bore the telltale blue tinge, his skin was waterlogged, and there was the sickly pallor of asphyxiation. But as Holmes's fingers brushed against the man's neck, he revealed a far more sinister truth. "Strangulation," Holmes said grimly. "The marks are faint but undeniable. This man did not drown." I felt a wave of unease settle over me. "Then what are you saying?" Holmes regarded the corpse with something resembling admiration. "I am saying," he murmured, "that someone went to extraordinary lengths to stage a drowning." Edward, still trembling, managed to croak out, "But why?" Holmes straightened, brushing the dust from his coat. "That, my dear Watson, is what we must now determine." He turned away from the body and gazed out into the fog-drenched city. "This case is no longer about a man who returned from the dead," he said quietly. "It is about a man who was never meant to be found." Holmes crouched beside the lifeless form of Albert Langford, his keen eyes sweeping over the corpse like a hawk, surveying its prey. The body had already revealed much: strangulation marks that contradicted the apparent drowning, the eerie familiarity of a man who had already been buried once. But there was something else. Holmes reached for the dead man's hands, lifting one carefully. He studied the fingertips for a moment, then turned to me with a glint in his eye. "Watson, do you observe the faint traces of ink beneath his fingernails?" I peered closer. Indeed, there it was, a dark stain, nearly imperceptible, yet undeniable. Holmes continued, almost to himself. A man fresh from the grave, wandering London, only to be found dead once more. Yet he had time to write something before his demise. Edward Langford, still shaken, let out a strangled whisper. "Then where is it? If he wrote something, where is it?" Holmes tapped the side of his temple. "An excellent question, Mr. Langford, and one which, I believe, will lead us directly to his killer." He straightened, his gaze flickering toward the dockside buildings. "Watson, we must find what he wrote, and we must do so before the river washes away the final traces of truth." He turned abruptly, his coat billowing behind him. "Come, our next answers lie not with the dead, but with the witnesses who saw the living." We found the dockworkers huddled beneath the eaves of a nearby warehouse, shielding themselves from the misty rain. They were rough men, their faces worn by years of labour, their expressions wary. But one, a wiry fellow with a weathered cap, stepped forward when Holmes addressed him. "You saw something unusual tonight," Holmes said, his voice low but commanding. The man hesitated, then gave a slow nod. I saw him." "Albert Langford?" The dockworker's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "If that's what you're saying he was called, then yes. I saw him." Edward exhaled sharply. "Where? When?" The man rubbed his jaw. "He was arguing with someone, right down by the wharf, not 20 minutes before you pulled him from the water." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Arguing? With whom?" The dockworker glanced at his companions before lowering his voice. "That's the thing, sir. I swear on my life he was arguing with himself." Watson and I exchanged glances. "Explain," I urged. The man licked his lips, clearly uneasy. "There were two of them, same height, same build, looked identical in the fog. One of them shouted something. 'You don't understand, I never wanted this.' Then there was a scuffle and a splash." Holmes was silent for a long moment, his mind visibly working through the information. Then at last he spoke. "Two Albert Langfords," he murmured. "One walking, one drowning." His expression darkened. "Which means, Watson, that our case is no longer one of simple murder." His eyes flickered toward the Thames, where the body still lay in grim repose. "This is a case of a man who should never have existed at all." Edward Langford looked as though his mind were on the verge of fracturing. "Two of them," he muttered, half to himself. "That's impossible. My brother had no twin." Holmes turned to him sharply. "Are you certain of that, Mr. Langford?" Edward hesitated. I believe so. We were close as boys, but I suppose there were always gaps in Albert's past. Times he would disappear for weeks. Money he couldn't explain, but a twin. Number I would have known. Holmes nodded slowly. Yet we have witnesses stating otherwise. 2 men, identical, and one is now dead. Again. I frowned. Then who was murdered tonight? Holmes exhaled. That, Watson, is the final puzzle. If Albert Langford was already dead and buried, then the man floating in the Thames cannot be him. Edward's voice was barely a whisper. Then who is he? Holmes looked down at the lifeless body once more. His fingers hovered over the ink-stained fingertips, his mind tracing unseen lines of logic. There is only one explanation, he said at last. One that explains the financial discrepancies, the staged resurrection, the blackmail, and now, the murder. I leaned closer. And that is... Holmes's voice was quiet but resolute. There was only ever one Albert Langford, and yet there were 2 men living under his name. Edward's breath hitched. You mean an imposter? Holmes inclined his head. Indeed. One Albert Langford died days ago. The other was silenced tonight. His gaze turned cold. And that means our killer still walks free. Chapter 4. The Deception Unravelled. The next morning, the London newspapers carried an announcement, an update regarding Albert Langford's second funeral. It was to take place at Highgate Cemetery, this time under strict supervision. Of course, it was all a lie. Holmes had dictated the false obituary himself, ensuring the news would reach precisely the right ears. Whoever had an interest in Albert Langford's grave would now have a reason to act, quickly. As we sat in 221B Baker Street, I watched Holmes carefully. His expression was unreadable, his mind already 5 steps ahead of the rest of us. You believe the culprit will take the bait? I asked. Holmes tapped his fingers against his knee. Not believe, Watson. No. The deception we have witnessed was not the work of a mere opportunist. It was a carefully constructed illusion, one that required meticulous planning. The person responsible has much at stake. Edward Langford, still pale from the events of the previous night, leaned forward. And when they come? Holmes allowed himself a rare smile. Then, Mr. Langford, we shall be waiting. And so, as dusk fell, we prepared for the final act of the charade, one that would lead us face to face with the man who had buried the truth beneath 6 feet of earth. The graveyard was deathly silent, save for the occasional whisper of the wind through the bare branches of the trees. The fog had settled thick upon the ground, curling around the gravestones like ghostly tendrils. Holmes and I had concealed ourselves among the weathered tombs, our breathing quiet, our presence unseen. Edward Langford waited with the constables some distance away. Time passed slowly. The distant chime of a church bell marked the hour. Then, movement. A lone figure emerged from the darkness, their steps careful, deliberate. They moved toward Albert Langford's disturbed grave, pausing for a moment before kneeling beside the headstone. Even from our hiding place, I could sense the urgency in their movements. They were searching for something. Holmes exhaled softly. Patience, Watson. The figure produced a spade, glancing over their shoulder before plunging it into the loose earth. Holmes's fingers tightened around my arm. Now, he whispered. And like a spectre rising from the mist, Sherlock Holmes stepped forward. That will do, Holmes said, his voice cutting through the still air like the stroke of a knife. The grave robber froze, their fingers tightening around the spade. For a moment, they seemed to weigh their options, fight or flee. Then, they ran. Holmes moved like a wolf in pursuit, his coat billowing behind him. I followed, my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure dodged between the headstones, their footfalls rapid against the damp earth. "Stop in the name of the law!" cried one of the constables, but it did little to deter them. They nearly reached the cemetery gates, nearly escaped into the fog beyond, when Holmes lunged forward, catching the fleeing man's coat and dragging him backward. The man stumbled, crashing into the gravel path. 2 constables descended upon him at once, pinning him down. I rushed forward, gasping for breath. The grave robber lay panting beneath the officer's grip, his hat knocked askew, his face pale beneath the gaslight. And then, as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, I heard Holmes's voice, low, quiet, and unmistakably satisfied. "Dr. Finch," he murmured, "we meet at last." The man beneath the constable's grip ceased struggling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I watched as Dr. Alistair Finch, the very physician who had signed Albert Langford's death certificate, looked up at Holmes with a gaze filled with equal parts defiance and resignation. "You," Edward Langford whispered. "You were his doctor. You knew." Holmes crouched beside the captive man, studying him as a predator might regard a wounded animal. "Indeed, Mr. Langford," he said coolly. "Dr. Finch did not merely know." He gestured toward the grave. "He orchestrated the entire deception." Dr. Finch's lips pressed into a thin line. "You cannot prove anything." Holmes smiled slightly. "Can I not?" He gestured to the disturbed earth. "You returned to this grave tonight, not to steal, but to hide." I felt a chill run through me. "Hide what?" Holmes turned his gaze back to Dr. Finch. "I suspect that you were not merely covering your tracks, Doctor. You were retrieving something, or someone." The man's fingers twitched. Holmes's smile widened. "You see, Watson, the most fascinating thing about this case is not that Albert Langford appeared to have died twice, but that only one of him was ever meant to be found." Holmes turned to the constables. "Take him away." As Dr. Finch was dragged to his feet, his mask of indifference finally cracked. "He forced my hand," he hissed. "I had no choice." Holmes tilted his head. "Did you not?" The doctor's gaze flickered with something close to fear. And in that moment, I realized the truth. There was still another player in this game. Dr. Finch sat in the dim confines of Scotland Yard's interrogation chamber, his once arrogant demeanour reduced to nervous twitches and darting glances. His fingers fidgeted against the tabletop as Holmes stood before him, silent, calculating. "You may wish to maintain your silence, Doctor," Holmes said at last, his voice deceptively mild. "But I assure you, the truth will emerge, with or without your cooperation." Dr. Finch exhaled, rubbing his temples. He knew there was no escape. At last, his lips parted, and in a hushed, brittle voice, he confessed. "It was a fraud," he muttered. "Albert Langford wasn't one man, he was 2. I felt my breath catch. "Twins?" Finch gave a jerky nod. "Yes, Albert had a brother, an identical twin, separated at birth. Few knew of him. The 2 reunited in adulthood and saw the opportunity." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "An opportunity for what?" Finch let out a bitter laugh. "What else?" "Money. A man who exists in 2 places at once. 2 sets of investments. 2 lives. 2 fortunes accumulating in parallel. One could disappear when debts arose, and the other could take his place." Edward Langford's face had turned pale. "My brother was stealing from his own estate." Dr. Finch nodded. "For years they lived as one man. When the real Albert Langford fell ill, his twin prepared to replace him permanently. But then, he died too soon." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And you, Doctor, helped conceal the truth." Finch's voice was barely a whisper. "I had no choice." Holmes leaned forward, his voice dark. "You had a choice, Finch. And now, your lies have left 2 men dead." Holmes's fingers tapped against the armrest of the chair as he processed Finch's words. "Tell me, Doctor," he said at last, "when Albert Langford died, why did his twin not simply assume his place as intended? Why the elaborate deception?" Dr. Finch exhaled. "Because someone found out. Someone discovered the fraud and blackmailed him." Edward gasped. Blackmailed? Finch nodded. The twin, let's call him James Langford, received a letter the very night Albert died. A demand for money, or the deception would be exposed. It terrified him. Holmes tilted his head slightly. Terrified him enough to stage a resurrection? Finch's lips trembled. He was desperate. He thought if he could make people believe Albert had returned from the grave, he could use the illusion to his advantage, to control the narrative. I shook my head. But something went wrong. Holmes's expression darkened. Indeed, James Langford was murdered before he could fully assume his brother's identity. And the question is, who silenced him? Finch's gaze dropped to the table. I don't know, he admitted. But I do know this. Whoever killed him wasn't acting alone. The blackmailer wasn't working in isolation. There was someone else, someone orchestrating the entire deception from the shadows. Holmes's jaw tightened. Then we are not at the end of this mystery. He straightened abruptly, his coat swirling around him as he turned toward the door. This is no longer a case of fraud, he murmured. It is a game of control, and the true player has yet to reveal their hand. The rain had begun to fall as we stepped out of Scotland Yard, the gaslights casting flickering reflections on the wet cobblestones. Holmes's expression was unreadable, his thoughts spinning faster than I could grasp. We have uncovered the deception, I said at last. Yet it does not feel like we have won. Holmes nodded. Because we have not, Watson. We have only unmasked a pawn. Edward Langford, still visibly shaken, ran a trembling hand through his hair. If Dr. Finch was merely a participant, then who? He swallowed hard. Who was truly behind it? Holmes's gaze lifted toward the darkened streets. A question I intend to answer before another body washes up in the Thames. A chill ran through me. You think the murderer will strike again? Holmes exhaled. Watson, a deception of this scale is not the work of a single mind. Someone orchestrated this. Someone with knowledge of Albert Langford's secret. Someone who stood to gain from his death. Edward's breath hitched. Eleanor, he whispered. Holmes turned sharply. Albert Langford's widow? Edward nodded. She knew more than she admitted. She had to. She was the one who received those letters after his death, the ones in his handwriting. She was the one who inherited everything once both brothers were gone. Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile. Ah, Watson, the most dangerous criminal is not the one who hides in the shadows. His eyes gleamed with something sharp and knowing. It is the one who stands in the light, draped in mourning veils. Chapter 5. The Mastermind, Behind the Shadows. We sat in the dim glow of 221B Baker Street, the rain tapping softly against the window. Holmes was silent, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes closed. But I knew better than to think he was at rest. For the past hour, he had spoken not a word, his mind working through the case in its entirety, revisiting each deception, each contradiction. Something still eluded him, but not for long. At last, his lips parted. Watson, he murmured, tell me, who benefited most from Albert Langford's death? I considered. His twin, at first, but then he too was murdered. Holmes nodded. And once both were gone? I frowned. His widow, Eleanor, she inherited everything. Holmes's eyes snapped open. Precisely. He rose from his chair and began to pace. Consider, Watson. The twin was blackmailed. He was forced into the desperate ploy of a resurrection. But what if the blackmailer never intended to let him live? What if the resurrection was merely the stage for the final act, a murder that would secure everything? A chill ran through me. You mean Eleanor orchestrated it all? Holmes exhaled slowly. Eleanor Langford, he murmured, is a widow of calculated grief, and I intend to prove it. The Langford estate was shrouded in mourning, its heavy curtains drawn, its hallways steeped in silence. Eleanor Langford received us in her parlour, draped in black, a vision of composed sorrow. Her pale fingers clutched a handkerchief, yet her eyes were dry. Holmes bowed slightly. "Mrs. Langford, forgive the intrusion at such a time." She inclined her head, her voice smooth. "I have suffered 2 losses, Mr. Holmes. What more is there to discuss?" Holmes studied her carefully. "A peculiar question," he murmured. "Unless, of course, you already know the answer." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "I beg your pardon." Holmes took a step closer. "Grief is a curious thing, Mrs. Langford. It leaves traces in every word, every gesture. And yet, when I look at you—" His gaze sharpened. "I see only relief." A flicker of something crossed her face, too quick to catch, but it was there. A crack in the mask. "I do not appreciate your insinuations, Mr. Holmes," she said coldly. Holmes smiled faintly. "I expected you wouldn't." He turned to Watson. "Shall we enlighten the lady, Watson? Shall we show her how grief can be quite the performance?" Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a bundle of papers. "Your husband, Mrs. Langford, was no stranger to deception. His fraud spanned years, disguised as clever investments. But you already knew that, did you not?" Eleanor's grip on the handkerchief tightened. "That's absurd." "Come now." Holmes cut her off, his voice sharper. "You were no blind, grieving wife. You discovered the fraud long before his death, and rather than expose him, you used it to your advantage." I watched as Eleanor's facade began to fracture. "You chose blackmail over justice," Holmes continued. "You held the secret over him, ensuring that when the time came, you would inherit a fortune untainted by scandal. But when his twin reappeared, the game changed." Eleanor's breath hitched. Holmes pressed forward. "2 Albert Langfords, one buried, one walking. And suddenly, your carefully laid plan was threatened. If the world discovered the deception, your inheritance would crumble. So, you forced his twin into the resurrection ploy while ensuring he did not live to tell the truth." Silence. Then, Eleanor exhaled, slow and measured. When she spoke, her voice had lost its feigned fragility. "Well," she murmured, "it seems you do not miss much, Mr. Holmes." Holmes smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No, Mrs. Langford," he said. "I do not." Eleanor Langford rose to her feet, her mourning veil casting shadows across her face. For the first time, she did not play the widow. She played the queen upon the board, cold, calculating, untouchable. "You have proof, I assume?" she asked lightly. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Proof? Not yet. But I have something far more dangerous." Eleanor tilted her head. "And what might that be?" Holmes stepped closer, his voice a whisper of steel. "I have the truth." A flicker of amusement touched her lips. "Truth is a fragile thing, Mr. Holmes. It is shaped by those who tell it." Holmes smiled. "Indeed. And I intend to tell it to Scotland Yard." Eleanor laughed softly. "And what shall you tell them? That I mourned too little? That my husband and his brother were deceivers, and I merely played the better game?" Holmes studied her. "I shall tell them how a woman, poised to inherit a fortune, saw an inconvenient loose end, a twin who refused to disappear. I shall tell them how she silenced him, making it appear as though he had risen from the grave, only to fall again." Eleanor's expression did not falter, but in her eyes I saw it, the first glimmer of doubt. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, would you be so kind as to call for Lestrade?" Eleanor's hands clenched. "You will regret this," she murmured. Holmes gave a small, polite bow. "Doubtful." As the constables arrived, Eleanor Langford stood motionless, her lips curled into a smile that did not reach her eyes. Even in capture, she remained defiant, the last piece of a grand deception. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a small, half-burned letter, its edges curled with soot. Even in its ruined state, one could still make out the smeared ink, the desperate scrawl of a man whose words had been meant to vanish. Eleanor Langford's gaze flickered toward the letter for only an instant, but it was enough. A single fleeting crack in her carefully composed facade. "You recognize it," Holmes observed coolly. Eleanor exhaled sharply. "Should I?" Holmes turned the letter toward the dim gaslight. "You should," he murmured, "for you are the one who tried to destroy it." I leaned forward, squinting at the faint script still visible on the parchment. Though much of it was illegible, one sentence remained clear. "Eleanor, I fear I am trapped. I never meant for this." Holmes studied Eleanor's face as he continued. "This was written by James Langford, the twin you so cleverly manipulated. He had discovered too late that his deception had become his own prison. He sought to escape, only to be silenced before he could." Eleanor's fingers twitched. Holmes smiled faintly. "You were meticulous, Mrs. Langford. You burned his final confession. But ink is a stubborn thing, is it not? Even in death, it speaks." Eleanor's lips parted, but Holmes held up a hand. "Spare me the denial. We both know the truth. And by the time I am done, so will Scotland Yard." Eleanor Langford straightened in her chair, the flickering candlelight casting shadows across her face. She was a woman accustomed to control, and even now cornered, she did not yield. "How dramatic, Mr. Holmes," she said smoothly. "But let us say, for the sake of amusement, that I did know about my husband's deception. What of it?" Holmes leaned forward. "Then tell me, Mrs. Langford, why did James Langford write you this letter? Why did he fear for his life?" Eleanor tilted her head, feigning confusion. "Albert's twin was a fraud, Mr. Holmes, a thief, just like his brother. If he feared for his life, it was no doubt due to his own misdeeds." Holmes's lips twitched. "Ah, you see, that is where your story unravels. If James Langford was nothing but a fraud, then why did he not take the fortune and disappear? Why did he stage an impossible resurrection rather than simply vanishing into the night?" Eleanor hesitated. Holmes seized the moment. "Because you would not let him." A ripple of silence passed through the room. Holmes continued, his voice like a blade. "You orchestrated everything, the blackmail, the resurrection, the deception. But when James realized he was merely a pawn in your game, he tried to escape. And so you silenced him." Eleanor's breath was steady, but her fingers curled imperceptibly. Holmes sat back satisfied. "You miscalculated, Mrs. Langford. You believed yourself the master of this game. But the moment you killed James, you became merely another player. And I do not play to lose." The room was deathly still. Eleanor Langford's breathing had become measured, deliberate, a woman calculating her final move. Then she exhaled a slow, almost amused sigh. "Tell me, Mr. Holmes," she murmured, "do you truly believe that truth alone is enough to convict me?" Holmes gave a small, polite smile. "No, Mrs. Langford. That is why I arranged for Lestrade to be listening from the hall." The colour drained from Eleanor's face as the door swung open, revealing Inspector Lestrade standing just beyond the threshold, his expression grim. Behind him, 2 constables stepped forward, their presence an unspoken command. Eleanor Langford remained still, her gaze flicking between Holmes and the waiting officers. For a moment, I wondered if she might attempt some last act of defiance. But at last, the mask cracked. Her lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You always were 3 steps ahead, weren't you?" Holmes inclined his head. 4, actually. The constables moved in, and as they took her by the arms, Eleanor did not struggle. Instead, she turned to Holmes one last time. "You see the world as a game of logic and consequence, Mr. Holmes. But tell me, what is a game without a worthy opponent?" Holmes held her gaze. "One I am glad to have won." Eleanor gave a soft laugh, her composure returning. "I almost regret losing." As she was led away, the candlelight flickered, casting her shadow long across the walls. And in that moment, I realized something. She had never been afraid. She had lost. But in her mind, she had played to the very end. Chapter 6. The Haunting Aftermath. The case of Albert Langford, his twin, and the deception that spanned beyond the grave had reached its inevitable conclusion. Yet as I sat at my desk, pen in hand, chronicling the affair, I found myself unsettled by the echoes it left behind. It had been a crime of cunning rather than violence, a murder not of passion, but of precision. Each move calculated, each deception a thread woven into a larger tapestry of greed, betrayal, and control. I paused, staring at the page before me, where my ink had begun to smudge beneath my fingertips. What was it, truly, that haunted me? Was it the cold, unshaken composure of Eleanor Langford, who had played the game to the very end, unrepentant in her downfall? Was it the realization that two men had been buried, both consumed by a lie that had outlived them? Or was it something more intangible, the whisper of something unresolved, something lurking just beyond reason? I turned in my chair, glancing toward Holmes, who sat across from me in his usual place by the fire. The case was over. And yet, he had not spoken a word. The fire cast long shadows against the walls of 221B Baker Street, the flickering light dancing across Holmes's features. He had not moved for some time, his gaze fixed upon the flames, his pipe resting, unlit, in his fingers. "Holmes," I ventured. No response. I frowned, shifting in my chair. "You have been silent for nearly an hour. The case is concluded. Eleanor Langford is behind bars. The deception unravelled. And yet—" Still he did not speak. I leaned forward, studying him. "Something troubles you." At last his lips parted. "Tell me, Watson," he murmured. "Do you believe in ghosts?" The question startled me. "Ghosts?" I repeated. "Surely, Holmes, you are not suggesting—" "I suggest nothing," he interrupted, still staring into the fire. "I merely ask, do you believe that a crime, however intricate, however meticulously executed, can ever be truly laid to rest?" I hesitated. "Surely justice has been served." Holmes exhaled slowly. "Has it?" He turned to me then, and for the briefest moment I saw something in his gaze that I had never seen before. Doubt. "The mind can rationalize," Holmes murmured, almost to himself. "But the soul always carries its ghosts." I frowned. "Holmes, what are you saying?" He tapped his fingers against the armrest, his expression unreadable. "Eleanor Langford was guilty, yes, but is guilt so easily defined? If a lie is told long enough, Watson, does it not, in time, become truth?" I did not understand his meaning, not fully. "Surely you are not suggesting Eleanor was innocent?" Holmes gave a quiet, humorless chuckle. "Number innocence is a word rarely applicable in such matters." He rose then, moving to the window, gazing out into the fog-laden streets below. "Tell me, Watson, do you recall what the dock workers claimed they saw?" I hesitated. "They swore they saw two Albert Langfords arguing before one was thrown into the river." "Indeed," Holmes mused. "Two Albert Langfords. A trick of the mist, perhaps. A misperception, or something else entirely." A strange chill crept along my spine. "You think there is something unresolved?" Holmes turned back to me, his face half in shadow. "Watson," he said quietly, "what if we were wrong?" We left 221B Baker Street shortly after, Holmes insisting that a walk would clear the remnants of a case that refused to be buried. The streets were nearly deserted, the mist curling through the lamplight in thin, ghostly tendrils. The silence was thick, unnatural, pressing in around us. And then Holmes stopped. I nearly walked past him before I noticed the rigid tension in his posture. His breath had slowed, his hands curled at his sides. "Holmes?" He did not answer. His gaze was fixed ahead, to where the fog thickened near the entrance of a narrow alleyway. At first I saw nothing, but then A shadow shifted within the mist. A man. He stood utterly still, half hidden by the fog, his features obscured. But there was something familiar. Then he took a step forward. The dim glow of the gaslight caught upon his attire, and I felt my blood turn to ice. A funeral suit. Holmes exhaled, a barely perceptible breath. "Watson," he murmured, "do not move." The figure lingered a moment longer, watching. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the mist. I let out a breath I had not realized I had been holding. "Holmes. Who was that?" Holmes did not answer. He simply stared after the vanishing figure, his expression unreadable. Holmes and I stood frozen, our breath curling in the cold air. The figure in the funeral suit lingered at the edge of the fog, unmoving, watching. Then he turned. Without a word, without hesitation, the man receded into the swirling mist, his silhouette dissolving into shadow. Not a hurried step, not a backward glance. We rushed forward, Holmes quick as a panther, his coat billowing behind him. Yet when we reached the alley's entrance, there was nothing. No man, no movement. Only footprints. They led into the mist, stark against the damp pavement. But even as we watched, they faded, as though swallowed by the night itself. Holmes stood very still, his expression unreadable. I swallowed, my heart pounding. "Holmes." He did not answer. The gaslight flickered, casting eerie shapes against the walls. The city was silent. The case was over. And yet, it felt as though something remained. Something unseen. Something waiting. I forced a breath, turning to Holmes. "It was a trick of the light," I said, though I hardly believed it myself. "The fog plays tricks on the eyes, and the footprints, the damp must have erased them." Holmes remained quiet. The firelight from a distant window flickered against his profile, highlighting the sharp angles of his face. His eyes, however, remained shadowed. "Holmes?" I pressed. At last, he exhaled. "Some mysteries," he murmured, "do not wish to be solved." A shiver ran through me. "You think—" "I think," he interrupted, "that there are things in this world that do not obey logic, Watson. And those things—" His voice dropped to something almost imperceptible. "They are best left undisturbed." The wind howled through the alley, rattling the gas lamps. Holmes turned on his heel. "Come, Watson, let us go home." We left the alleyway, the fog shifting like a living thing around us. And though we did not look back, I could not shake the feeling that something was still watching.